Welcome to our second installment of our holistic DE&I approach series. My name is Matt Houston, chair of the DE&I committee, a collaboration between the University of North Texas at Dallas, Dallas College, the Dallas Regional Chamber, and other community organizations that are here together to work for not only bettering Dallas, but bettering our society. Before we get started, I would like to read a quick disclaimer as we are ensuring this a safe space for all to participate. The views, positions, and opinions expressed by speakers, attendees, sponsors, or other third parties at a Holistic Approach Series event are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect those of UNT Dallas or Dallas College. UNT Dallas and Dallas College make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, timeliness, suitability, or validity of any information presented by speakers, attendees, or sponsors at the Holistic DE&I Approach Series event, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. UNT Dallas and Dallas College do not endorse and expressly disclaim all liability relating to any of products or services provided by speakers, attendees, or sponsors. Also, I would like to encourage everyone to maintain open-mindedness, receptibility, as we are going to have an exciting discussion on the holistic approach of DE&I in the government space. I also have the honor to introduce to you our moderator of this event. Some of you all have seen him last year in our DE&I series, as he stated the current state of DE&I in Dallas, Mr. Jared Fitzpatrick. And so we are honored to have him as our moderator. But first, his bio. Jared Fitzpatrick is the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Dallas Regional Chamber. In this role, Jared is responsible for helping the DRC's over 800 member companies advance DE&I in their organizations. Jared works closely with the permanent DRC board level DEI Council and its 4 sub-councils, which are focused on diversity and leadership, education and workforce, community investment in underserved areas, and policy and policing and criminal justice policies. Without further ado, I would like to welcome you all. I would like to welcome Jared Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone, and welcome today. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Before we jump into it, I really just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, everyone has the ability to unmute themselves, and just to ensure that there's no distractions during the webinar, we want to ask you to keep your microphones on mute while others are speaking. However, this is an interactive session, and we want to hear your questions. So we do encourage you to use the Q&A feature or the chat box during the webinar, and then we'll reserve some time at the end to answer your questions. Lastly, if you haven't already noticed, this session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared after the webinar ends. Now, I know we just got started. I see a couple more people trickling in. So if you would like to, feel free to share your LinkedIn profile in the chat so that you can continue to network with some of the attendees after the event. Okay, so let's jump into it. I'm happy to introduce 2 of our partners to share brief remarks. I'm going to start with Miss Debbie Richards. Debbie is the Director of Community Engagement, Outreach, and Recruitment for Dallas College. She is also a member of the Dallas College Governmental Affairs team, excuse me. Born and raised in White Rock area of Dallas, Ms. Richards' career with Dallas College began in June of 1972 and continues today. And I'm going to pause here and just tell a quick story, because I was talking with Debbie yesterday, and she told me, which I thought this was amazing, that she graduated from high school and got her job at Dallas College. On her second day at Dallas College, she actually had to take a half day of vacation to attend her own high school graduation. So she's been doing this for a long time, y'all. During her tenure with Dallas College, she has served as director of admissions and registrar for Richland Collegiate High School, grant specialist, a program planner. In addition to all of that, she is a noted community leader and an effective problem solver. Her 50+ years of progressive experience and responsibilities include working with local, state, and federal workforce agencies, chambers of commerce, as well as ISDs, both large and small, and business entities. So I am so thankful that you are here with us this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. Debbie, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to welcome and thank all of y'all for joining our conversation today. Last year, the Dallas College Board of Trustees established the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion as an operations support area focused on amplifying, encouraging, and supporting our community and its needs. The DEI office has hosted supplier diversity outreach events, attended construction expos, attended and sponsored Chamber of Commerce DEI events, and the DEI office continues to research upcoming procurement opportunities and communicating them to our partner agencies and diverse vendors. To achieve inclusion, the Dallas College Department of DEI is focused on equal access to opportunities for our students, equal access to opportunity for our employees. We currently have 6 very active employee resource groups: a welcoming campus environment, DEI education, community relations, and engagement through reporting and communication. And if I could take a brief personal moment here to invite everyone to another DEI event. Dallas College is one of the sponsors for the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce Experiencing DEI series. The 5th program of the series is February 18th with Janie Schultz and Casey Thomas for a discussion on racial equity in Dallas. If you're interested, please go to the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce website. The event is open for registration and there is no cost to attend. And I want to thank you all again for the opportunity today, and I want to turn it back to Jared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. All right, so next I would like to introduce our additional partner to share some remarks, Wanda Boyd. All right, there you go, Wanda. Wanda is the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Equal Opportunity and the Chief Human Resources Officer for UNT Dallas. She joined the UNT System Human Resources team in 2019, following 3 years at Texas A&M University. A graduate of University of Houston, go Cougs. She has also worked in HR and employment relations for over 25 years and has gained a lot of experience in both the public and private sectors, spanning the full life cycle of HR and employee relations with a specific emphasis on equity compliance. Wanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jared. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited that we have come together, all of the partners that you've heard from, to bring to you this series of DEI live streamed events. I think this holistic approach, especially with today being a focus on government, really is where we need to be as we work together. Last week, we discussed the holistic approach to DEI from an academic perspective, and then we'll bring you corporate next week. So hopefully, as we conclude our time here together, you will find some information very valuable, some actionable items that you can take and just really bring us together as we do this work that is really a journey and not just a step-by-step process, but together, I think, as we've heard before, we can make a difference. And with this approach and what you hear today, I think will be valuable. Please, as you've heard already, this is something that should be active and engaging and a great place for us to work together to move the needle forward. Use the chat feature, send us your questions. You're gonna hear from some great people today. And we hope again that you learned something valuable, and we look forward to time together And don't forget to join us again next week so that you can get the full value from this series. Thank you so much, and we appreciate all of our partners, and we look forward to just doing great things in this space together. Thank you, Jared.
All right. Thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Debbie. Okay, so now I am so excited to introduce our panelists for today's discussion, Kim O'Neill and Dr. Lindsay Wilson. So I'm going to start with Kim, and just on a personal note, Kim is amazing. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with her today. Kim O'Neill is an award-winning professor, an executive leader, and a social good expert. She was the youngest serving African-American woman city manager in the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. In addition, as a veteran senior government and nonprofit executive, Kim has used her voice to impact policy decisions while lobbying in New York City and on Capitol Hill. She now works within the social sector and leads Giving Blueprint, which is a consulting company with a mission to impact social change through the development of strategic partnerships and growth plans within the social sector. As a social entrepreneur, Kim recognizes the value that nonprofit startup organizations provide to communities, especially in historically discriminated communities. In January 2015, she launched Cause Studio, an incubator and a training initiative that's designed to reduce the number of failing nonprofit organizations in North Texas. In addition to all of that, Kim has been recognized as a 2017 Minority Business Leader Awards honoree by the Dallas Business Journal, a 2019 Humanitarian Visionary Award honorable mention by the Juanita J. Craft Civil Rights House and Museum, and a 2020 Social Innovation Award honoree by the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. She has also served as the chair for the City of Plano Community Relations Commission. Okay, if I just stopped there, that's more than enough. But there is more. In addition to being a sought-after thought leader, a strategist, and a speaker, Kim is also a published author and a professor who was honored as the 2017 Outstanding Associate Faculty of the Year for Collin College. She's currently an adjunct professor for the School of Professional Advancement at Tulane University, where she facilitates graduate courses for the Masters of Public Administration program. And Kim is the founding director of Power in Action, a collective of Dallas leaders focused on advancing the Black community. She's also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and a founding member of the Heritage Giving Fund, the first Black giving circle in Texas. Whew, Kim, I don't know how you sleep. Look, you do so much. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. All right. I'm also excited to introduce Dr. Lindsay Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the Equity Officer for the City of Dallas, Office of Equity and Inclusion, Equity Officer. So she is the person who's getting all this work done that you hear about in the news. In her position, Dr. Wilson leads a citywide equity effort across all city departments with the goal of embedding Dallas's core value of equity in all the city does. That includes budgeting, policies, programs, community engagement, and overall service delivery. As the equity officer, Dr. Wilson supports the staff, leadership, and the community in normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing equity to help shape a city government and a Dallas where everyone has the opportunity to thrive no matter their background. Now, Dr. Wilson works internally with city departments to provide professional development, technical assistance, and education surrounding equitable principles and practices. In addition, she facilitates critical conversations about targeted efforts to reduce racial disparities, the analyzation of policies and procedures, and building and strengthening robust community collaborations. Now, in her previous role as the Senior Programs Coordinator for Snohomish County, Dr. Wilson served in various capacities advancing equity in Everett, Washington. She holds over 10 years of experience in local government and has a background in post-secondary education as she supported the University of Washington's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion through the development and oversight of graduate student programming for racially diverse populations. She holds a master's in counseling and a doctoral degree in educational psychology from the University of Washington in Seattle, where she examined the intersection of race, community engagement, gender, and socioeconomics. Throughout her career, she has focused on racial disparities and the impact of narratives. That story is so important. And her work challenges the status quo and has been published in peer-reviewed journals. Her motto is equity is everyone's work and seeks to centralize it in all of her endeavors. Woo, we have two powerhouses on our panel today. Thank you both for being here. Let's jump right into it. So we have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask. And then, as I said at the beginning of the call, we want to hear from the audience and hear your questions either in the Q&A feature or in the chat, and then we'll get to those at the end. Okay, so I'm going to pose this question to both of you. I think it's important that we start with the why. Right? We're having this conversation. We've been talking about this stuff for years. So why is this important? I mean, from the inception of our country, government at the local, regional, state, and federal levels have played an integral role in creating and maintaining some of the inequities that we see today. I mean, government controls everything from who could vote, who could be a citizen, who can own property, where you can live. So why is there a need for increased focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in government?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for having me. It is such an honor. And Jared, what a great question. I really appreciate the framing around the why, right? So here at the City of Dallas, as you mentioned, one of the core values is equity, and we require all of our directors to take an equity one-on-one training. And we're working on offering that to all city employees. But within that two-part training, we have a specific section that gets to that, the why of equity in city government, right? And so again, we're talking equity and not equality, because we know in order for us to truly get to equality, we have to go through equity. But nonetheless, governments, as you mentioned, at all levels have played a role in not only creating, but also maintaining racial inequity. And so we look at it in three particular phases, right? So that initial phase was the explicit ways in which racial oppression was baked into government at all levels. Government passed and reinforced laws that determine, as you mentioned, who could vote, who could own property, where one could live, but also who was considered property and who could marry whom, and so much more, right? Really explicitly. And then the second phase moved into more implicit, or described as race neutral. So policies that spoke to all residents, right? So more of a colorblind approach. So we went from who couldn't have access to now everyone can. And within those two phases, we missed a key element to actually look at now the challenges that had already been baked in. And so what we've seen in that second phase, right, when we talk about race neutral policies, is that it truly perpetuates, right, the disparities. And that second phase allowed for our inequities to, in fact, worsen. And so currently, we like to think of this as the third phase, where we recognize that we have to be intentional and just as explicit around race if government wants to make progress on reducing racial inequities. It's necessary to address it and acknowledge that race is a key factor in the creation of these inequities. And so, in other words, governments must transform from the inside out. And that's what the equity division really stands on. Our work is majority internal with other city departments, recognizing that government plays a key role in the ways in which we offer our services and the disparities that we see today. And so I believe that we are starting to see that across various municipalities with the help of organizations like Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And so Gare, but also would like to just take a moment to highlight the leadership and the key role that plays in not only why equity in city government, but how we can address this systemic issue, right? So when we think about, our leadership here at the City of Dallas, and on March 24th, 2021, the City Council passed a racial equity resolution, which reaffirmed not only our commitment as a city to embedding equity in all that we do, but most importantly, to first understanding and then addressing, right? And that understanding piece is key, because we went from a government to which we said, again, explicit racial oppression, to now everyone has access without looking intentionally at the challenges that first phase created. So I'll stop there. I could go on for hours, but I want to pass the mic and hear from Kimberly.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I am glad to be on the opposite side this week and not serving as moderator to tap into this conversation, because it does mean so much to me. There is a need for us to focus, and not just an increased focus, but we just need to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. As someone who has worked in and around government at some point for since 1994, quite honestly, what I have seen, there have been so many changes, and the internal practices and policies, the changes that have been made to keep out people who are residents in cities and in county governments, to make sure that this traditional way and this traditional approach to ensuring the opportunities within leadership and other aspects of government kept out the residents of those particular cities and governments. It says a lot about how our governments have been operating. And we think, since we've passed times of the civil rights movement, that things are just so different. We used to simply call it equal opportunity, but as Dr. Wilson talked about, we're really talking about equity. But I really think, quite honestly, if we're talking about why, there has to be a focus on DEI, but there has to also be a focus on justice. We have to own and admit what has happened in the past so that we can understand the context of some of the decisions that have been made, whether they be good or bad, right? I'm not necessarily blaming any one person or any one group, but we have to own and admit what has happened and write that so that we can concentrate on what does this look like moving forward and what needs to happen right now. And one of the things that I find that is missing is we focus on DE&I, and I like to say DEI and A, because I feel like we leave out people with disabilities and what it means to have accessible communities and governments for people. But I think we also have to own justice. And we have to own why we are here and why this topic, quite honestly, still has to come up. And it always has to come up because we have not properly addressed what justice looks like. And I'm not talking about protests or anything like that. I'm talking about owning what has happened within our governments so that we can make each of them better. So my add to this is we're focusing, not just increased focus, but we have to really focus on this, and we have to start with justice so that we can do DE&I properly, and A, so that it remains in our government and becomes a healthy environment for all our community and for our employees as well.
I love that. I love that. Dr. Wilson, I love when you talked about the 3 phases and how we went from explicit racial oppression, skipped over phase 2, went straight to everybody has access. We're all, the same, equal opportunity. And now we're having to go back and address what Kim talked about, which is with the justice portion. Look and see how did the effect of that explicit racial oppression impact why we are the way we are today, and what can we do to make that right? So going back, owning it, and then addressing it. I love that. Kim, I had to take a note down when you said DEI and A. I've seen that acronym get longer and longer. I've seen justice added to it. I've seen other acronyms in there, but I love the add of accessibility. I think that's really important. Okay.
to that, Jared, I want to add why that's important. Because when people typically hear DEI, there's this limiting belief around race and gender and ethnicity, right? And sexual orientation. But there are people, whether or not disabilities are visible or invisible, we tend to forget the inclusion part. And it's about including everyone and how we make our environments welcoming for everyone. But we have the disability community still fighting to just get into the conversation about DEI. And so we have to pay attention. And that's why we're starting to see the A added, because it is an important component. For me, we shouldn't have to do the separation. But if that means we're forcing the conversation so that the disability community is not left out, then we must begin to talk about the accessibility portion as well.
That's good. And I know there's an organization here called Disability In that does a lot of good work within the corporate sector. And so maybe we'll talk about that during our next session. Okay, Kim, you brought up something which I thought was really interesting. So you said you've been doing this work since 1994, right? And so you've been at this for a while. Something people may not know about you is that you really started your career in the equity space, serving as the EEO compliance coordinator for the New York City Equal Employment Practices Commission. So how has that shaped your career trajectory and just the way that you view this work that you do?
It's actually very interesting, right? So before we started saying DE&I, the work of equal employment, and I think Dr. Wilson mentioned that before, that this is not just about equality, right? That this is about equity, and this is about balancing things out and ensuring that people, you're not just at the starting line, but you're at the point that allows you to compete with everyone else fairly, right? And when I remember when I started my career, I started in fair housing first, and in New York City. And I've done a number of internships with the federal government with the EEOC. But when I got to the Equal Employment Practices Commission, it was very clear that the work that we were doing was not just about equal employment. The work that we were doing back then was about equity, and it was about inclusion. But I also paid attention to when we talked about affirmative action. I paid attention to how equal opportunity came to the table, and we started talking about that. And I remember just thinking, as a professional, at some point, I might phase myself out of a career, because if we do this right, is there going to be a need for me? Who would have thought that decades later, we would still be talking about the same doggone thing that we had been talking about decades before I was even old enough to tap into the workplace? So I think what it provided to me, it wasn't necessarily about the titles and the terms that we used. It was about the fairness and the approach to, especially in New York, the things that I was fighting for in my position was about ensuring that the city of New York represented the people within the city of New York. So if I'm doing compliance audits on retention practices or recruitment practices of city employees, and the majority of employees in one of the most diverse cities in the country, if overwhelmingly more than 90% of the employee workforce is all white male, we've got a problem. And to begin to have those conversations, and I openly still have those conversations. So it shaped my work, because for me, this is about fairness. This is about representation. This is about ensuring that if I'm a taxpayer, I can't believe, or if I was younger, I wouldn't believe that I would have access to certain things if I'm not seeing anyone that looks like me or anyone that looks like my neighbors in positions of authority. And what that also means for me is that it made me pay attention to the decision makers in government. And that is honestly why I pushed so hard to get to leadership positions, because there had to be other people at the table making decisions for communities of color, communities that were marginalized or historically discriminated and marginalized. And so it changed my trajectory and what I wanted to do, because I always felt like somebody's voice had to be at the table. That even when it was uncomfortable, that we had to talk about these things, but we can't talk about this for another 50 years. we're not making progress if we are talking about the same thing and all we do is change terminology. Because I truly believe that's what we're doing at times. We're changing terminology and we're finding really great ways to describe that. But what is the movement and what's the action? And have we really pushed the needle? Not a little bit, but a lot. And if we're not doing that, we're making it look great and comfortable for people. But our leaders have to do a lot more to make sure this action becomes a reality.
Whew, you said a mouthful there, but I want to hone in on two things. One, I agree with you. I think the terminology has shifted, but the conversation is still the same. And you know, when I got into diversity and inclusion work, one of the things I used to say was, I'm here to put myself out of a job. And I stopped saying that because I realized how impractical that actually was. Right, that in my lifetime, I would no longer, roles like this would no longer be necessary. I hope for it, I pray for it, but just seeing the history, I struggle with that. I want to touch on something else that you know, we talked about in our prep session. You know, you had the honor of being one of the youngest African-American female city manager in the history of the United States. I know that title is, and the accolades that go along with that were probably very positive, but I'm sure there were things that probably weren't as positive about the climate and the things you might have had to face. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, the good and the bad?
Sure, to be quite honest, I never owned the first in terms of openly sharing it, and I knew it when I was in the position. The first time I started talking about that openly was probably 5 or 6 years later. And I did it because to have to continue to say first, only, youngest, Black, Latinx, Asian American, person with disability, somebody from the LGBTQIA, or whomever that representative is for a community, to have to say that in the 21st century is heartbreaking. And it doesn't feel good because at some point, quite honestly, for me, it felt like tokenism, right? But my experiences probably are the reasons why I didn't share it. Not being respected, you know, for my community, for the city that I represented. But when I had to go and represent the city outside of the city or even outside of our region, I was often mistaken for someone's assistant, not even like their executive, like their secretary. They would redirect me to different rooms. No, this room is for city managers. People not thinking I was old enough to make major decisions. I was the lead at a table negotiating a 245-acre mixed-use development on behalf of the city, the largest development that was going to happen in that city, that doubled the size of that city when it was completed after I left. And so people kind of miss when we have to use first only. I shied away from that because I wanted people to pay attention to what I was doing. But from a representations perspective, I started sharing it because I needed other people to know that they too could be a city manager, that they too could ascend to different places and positions of high leadership in our governments around the country. That is why I started talking about it. And it's honestly still quite uncomfortable to always have to refer to it at that time that I was the youngest serving in this country. And so it didn't always feel good. I wasn't old enough. I didn't have enough experience. I didn't have enough education, but I was sitting on 2 master's degrees. You name it, I heard it and I felt it. And it wasn't just behind my back. It was sometimes right in my face. And so it has been very, very hard. And I have made a concerted effort to make sure that even when I have to check myself, right? Because I own that too. That person's not too young to do that job because that's what they said about me. For me, it's can they do that job, right? Do they have the experience or can we give the opportunity? They have the basics of what they need to navigate this space. What else do we do to help build people up? And I did not find that there were environments, there was no one for me to talk to. No one understood my pain. No one could mirror my experiences. And so there were times I really suffered in silence in those positions, in that particular position. And it didn't change when I went to other leadership positions in governments around the country. So for me, I love government. I love specifically municipal government. I joined municipal government because I wanted to make a difference on the lowest level of government that touched the people. That was it for me. But the road that I've had to take in order to do that, no one person should ever have to deal with some of the things that I've dealt with, and I'm not alone. And the sad part about it, Jared, is in 2022, there are people still going through the same exact thing right now. So have we really moved the needle, or are we just making the optics look better? We probably have shifted and moved in some way, but at the end of the day, we've not moved as much as we should have moved. That was 2004. This is 2022. So what, 18 years later? And I feel like we're really still in the same place. So the terminology changing hasn't changed the environment unless leaders are going to be very committed in ensuring that the change happens, not just the terminology.
Okay, that's like a finger snap moment right there. I mean, thank you for sharing openly about that. You know, I can sense that it still is raw and uncomfortable for you to talk about. So thank you for sharing that with us. Dr. Wilson, I want to turn things over to you. You have a unique role because as the equity officer for the city of Dallas, you have insight into all of the things that the city is doing to improve equity around Dallas. I would just love to know, can you share some of the initiatives that the city is working on? Give us like a little peek behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And thank you for the question. And I don't know how I'm gonna follow Kimberly, but you set me up for the okie doke. No, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that I want to mention is that the equity division is a part of the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Right. So we have 5 different divisions within that Office of Inclusion, and we are all tasked with specific work that really provides synergy as an entire office. But we also have a diversity and inclusion component within our HR. So there's a lot of different pieces where people are pushing certain aspects of this work forward in different spaces. Under the Office of Equity and Inclusion, we have a Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs division. We have a Human Rights division, a Fair Housing division, a Resilience division, and then of course the Equity division, which is the division that I oversee. And I think before we dive into a number of the initiatives and work that we continue to push forward, I think it is important to just build off of what Kimberly was mentioned in regards to the importance of leadership, right? And so motto is equity is everyone's work, and we know we all have a role in this work. And leaders have a very specific role. And so we know the Office of Equity, which was what it was originally called in 2018, was stood up by our city manager, T.C. Broadnex. And in 2018, there wasn't a ton of offices of equity or offices of equity and inclusion tasked with the very specific work that we are. And so we were on that front forward of that work. And I think that's important to note for a couple of reasons. One, when we're talking about the type of work that we're doing, we have had that opportunity to lay that foundation. And as you mentioned earlier during my introduction, this normalized, organized, and operationalized piece of it. And it may resonate with some of our attendees and it may not. So I want to just give a few highlights of what we're talking about when we say that and how it really feeds the work that not only my division is doing, but really how we are baking it into the city's daily services. And so when we talk about normalizing, it's that sense of urgency. It's that sense of urgency that we can't wait till tomorrow and then 9, 18, 25 years from now, we've, as Kimberly mentioned, just changed the language to the work that we're doing. We have to have these conversations now. We have to understand what that means for our specific line of work today and how we begin to close those disparities. And a part of that normalization is also that shared language. I'm not quite sure how many of you on today's call often, as you're engaging in this work, can run into some that may have some slight confusion, right, between equity and equality. I think that we often hear the word equity now, but sometimes once we get into the nitty gritty, it's really an example of equality that, hey, I'm doing right because I gave everyone the same exact thing. So we don't need to do that here in this space. And so that's a part of that normalization piece, is making sure that we are talking that same language. It's one of our core values. And so our departments, it's critically important to understand what that means as we're talking about the work that transportation or the Office of Equity or PUD or whomever else in the city department is doing. Organizing internally, something that many viewers may not know is the City of Dallas has an equity core team. And again, it really just builds off of that model that this work can't sit in one space and really have the transformative change that it needs to impact our residents' lives. And so what that means is our equity core team is made up of a member from every single one of our city departments, right? So they're the expert in their area of service. And they also are working closely as a liaison with the equity core team, right? And so really trying to embed that in every one of our departments. Externally, when we are talking about organizing, it's that partnership that we create to close the gap. So the city has the Dallas Equity Indicators Report. And that report was released in 2019, and it compared 2 years of data over 5 different themes, right? We looked at education, we looked at public health, we looked at economic opportunity, injustice in government, and neighborhoods and infrastructure. I always feel like it's a quiz when I gotta name the 5 themes. But we looked at all of that, right? Because racism doesn't show up when we're talking about closing gaps and addressing racial and ethnic disparities. And you'll hear me talk much about that because that's what my division leads with. We certainly take an intersectional approach. We certainly have other divisions focused on other aspects of that piece, right? And we're all under one office again, so we have that synergy. But it's particularly important recognizing the disparities that we do see based on race and ethnicity here in the city of Dallas. And that's what that equity indicators shows. It highlights where those largest gaps are, right? And so when we're talking about organizing, that happens both internally with our city departments as it regards to, again, the work that we do and where we have the most impact or influence to close those disparities, but also externally as we're talking to community partners, right? As we're talking to our various educational community partners and so forth, so that, again, we can have that synergy because it's all interconnected. And then the last piece, and I'll wrap it up, is the operationalization piece, right? So it's great to have shared language, and it's wonderful to have this sense of urgency and us all to come together and organize around pushing this work forward. But when you start to think and talk about the sustainability of this work or how this work is actually going to be embedded, we have to have tools, right? So that this work, again, doesn't just sit in my division, but really how are other departments now taking those other 2 components to operationalize it, to make it a part of their daily work, to ask those different questions, to think about the work that they do differently and how it's going to impact our communities that have previously been disinvested and currently experiencing those disparities. And so we do that in a number of ways. One of the ways that I can talk about that we've operationalized it is on the onset of COVID-19, our division, our office understood that it was going to be disproportionality, right? When you think about access, when you think about accessibility to things like internet and who can work from home and who can't work from home. And so one of the things that we did on the front floor was create this equity impact assessment tool. And that tool really took into consideration race, ethnicity, wealth, social vulnerability, and age, because we understood at that time that COVID-19 was disproportionately impacting our elders. And that tool allowed for other city departments to really provide equitable services, right? And so again, we use that word equitable, but when I say equitable services within that tool, I'm talking about examples like when we rolled out mobile testing, right? And there wasn't enough resources to do it around the entire city. So we had to find a way to be able to roll that out in the communities who had the greatest need, right? When we're talking about the ARPA funding that we're getting or that we've received, right? And so the ways in which our office has pulled together to establish a tool to help the city think about what it means to allocate in an equitable manner. And then most recently, the work that we are doing around the racial equity plan. So I referenced the racial equity resolution that was passed by council, but that called for a plan. And so our division is overseeing that plan in partnership with our vendor, Cospero Consulting. And really, we call it a plan, but it's truly a strategic framework to which any one of our residents and community partners can pick that up at its completion and say, what is this department doing to address racial and ethnic disparities that we see here in the city of Dallas? And so if I can do a quick plug before passing the mic back to you, we are pleading for community input at this point. We are doing internal and external conversations at the same time. So anyone on this call, please visit We Are One Dallas and provide input as to what you would like to see in this plan. So those are just a few things, believe it or not, that we are working on.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much. I just posted a link to the We Are One Dallas in the chat. It's really easy for those of you who have not given any feedback. I did it, took maybe 5 minutes. It was pretty quick. So I can't believe that we are already at 12:50. I know we had some more questions to go through, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we can end on time at 1. One thing I did want to provide, though, and I think every webinar I think should have this aspect, the tools and resources to help people either learn more or to take tangible action within their roles. So, Dr. Wilson, you talked about the equity impact assessment tool. I wanted to know, and this is for both of you, are there other tools that you can share? If there's links to things that you could post in the chat, or if there's resources that you would suggest to help people continue to learn more about this topic, I would love for you to share.
I think one of the places everyone should start with is their own backyard. You know, I'm a big believer, I say all the time, your voice is your currency. And sometimes we pay close attention to what's happening around us, but we forget to pay attention to what's happening right in our own backyards. And so if you are in North Texas, if you live in Dallas, I think taking advantage of everything that's happening in Dallas and ask questions, not just reading, not just understanding that there are equity initiatives, but that how does this benefit and impact what's happening in your life and in your own backyard? Same thing for us is in the city of Fort Worth in terms of their equity initiatives. No matter where you live, you need to pay attention to the things that are happening and the decisions that are being made, and get active and get vocal, even if it's just asking for clarifying questions on what something means. I think, you know, people, as a political science professor, we tend to get very comfortable, but we pay attention to what's happening nationally. We pay attention just more so on what's happening on the state level and nationally. But the level of government that touches us and our quality of lives more than anything is what's happening locally. And so it's important for us to pay attention to that. And I also think it's really important for us to pay attention to leaders and how leaders are showcasing and enforcing some of the equity initiatives. One thing that I always say, it's nice to have equity divisions and departments and folks, but are they empowered to do their job? They are professional experts who have been hired. Are they a figurehead? Or are they there to create change? And when we have cities where we see changes happening based on leaders, so a strong mayor city that may come out, the equity initiatives have to stay in place. Equity initiatives can't change with leaders. That's why we have to start over so many different times. The priority is the priority. And for leaders that are changing, that are coming in, when you come in, it means that you continue the work. You don't pull back and you don't go in a different direction unless it's not working. But too many times we see our professional experts that have been brought in, that they're not empowered to make the decisions and to provide the information to our government. And the second part, we often see that for leaders, it's no longer a priority, because if it's not their experience, it's not their understanding. And so we have to make sure that the equity initiatives continue and get stronger over time.
And that was good. Oh, that was good. And Dr. Wilson, I see you've been posting tons of stuff in the chat. Thank you for doing that. Any resources, tools that you would suggest?
Absolutely. So I did drop a few in the chat. One is Advancing Workforce Equity in Dallas and Collin Counties, the Blueprint for an Action. And within that report, it highlighted how Dallas could bring in more than $115 billion if we close racial disparities. So that was one resource that has specific recommendations, but also equity indicators report, segregated by design, race forward, GARE. There are a few other resources. Happy to keep dropping them in the chat there for people to access. Oh, well, maybe I just did it to the panelists. And so thank you, Kimberly.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know you gave them to me.
Yeah, my apology. We typically use Teams, so yes, but there they are. Thank you.
Okay. And I know we're running short on time here, but we did get a question, and I wanted to make sure that I asked it. So this question is directed towards Kim. Kim, your experience and your time in government have been really inspiring. Thank you for being honest about your journey. For young professionals entering public service, what qualities do you believe are important? Again, just recognizing that within government today, we see so much vitriol and a disrespect for others' opinions. So what qualities do you believe are important for young professionals entering public service or government work?
First, not to code switch. You need to show up as your authentic selves in the workplace, because in order for us to really do this equity work, we cannot assimilate to any other standards other than who we are. Cultural representation is very important in the workplace. And so my first thing, as frustrated, I feel like I was in government. Anybody that I talk to that's in government, they know I will just start downloading a lot of what they can do. And when I say can do, ethically and unethically, that's what I'm really talking about. But then I talk about positioning, and I talk about the importance of being who you are when you show up, because it makes a difference And it helps people, it helps to normalize the fact that we are normal, right? And I'm not limiting this to Black people. I'm saying this across the board. Young professionals, there are rules, right? In terms of that are for everybody. But in terms of losing sight of who you are, I think that you have to own that, because that's how we make sure the important pieces that need to be factored into these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, accessibility, and justice, we cannot talk about what is not seen. So number one, show up. Number two, when you show up in authority and own dominion over what you know well, and share those things and be comfortable in that. I wish that I had peers during my time, especially in New York City, where we were a unionized environment. So it was a whole different ball game. I wish I had peers to just download and exchange dialogue with in government, but I didn't. So there were a lot of tears. There was a lot of stress, but I walked in with a smile on my face because I felt like I had a responsibility. No one should have to do that anymore at all. And if we do equity right, we won't have to do it anymore. So show up as your full self. I can't remember, maybe I'll forward it. There's the current CEO of Essence Magazine used to work for Target. And she talks about showing up as your full self. And I just caught wind of one of her presentations a few months ago. And she did it, the conversation she did when she was at Target. And she talks about first own the fact that you have the skills to do your job, but you also have to be authentic. And if you can't be authentic and where you work, there's a problem, right? And so I want you all, for young professionals, you are needed in government. I left because I now feel my experiences are better on the outside than they are on the inside. So I do this from a strategic perspective. But we need young people, we need vocal young people, not disrespect, but we need vocal people who will show up at their greatest authentic self, and they will not code switch. If you don't hear anything else from me today, do not code switch in government. Who you are is needed at the table. So as we move forward with these equity initiatives, we can make sure we're factoring in what's culturally relevant to each of you. Right? Because we need more people at the table to represent different races, different ethnicities, from a sexual orientation perspective, accessibility issues. We need all of that at the table to ensure that we are paying attention to the most important parts of our community, and we can't do it if you won't be your authentic selves.
Whew, okay. Y'all came with the fire today. And Kim, I'm posting a video from Caroline Wenga here, so everybody can see that. Okay, I know we have about 2 minutes left. I'm just going to ask any final thoughts. Kim, I'll start with you, and then Dr. Wilson will go to you.
I feel like I've said a mouthful. If you are not working in government, wherever you live, get involved in government. And I'm not just talking about voting. I'm just talking about make sure you understand decisions that are being made, make sure you're providing feedback. That's my greatest feedback to everybody. Get involved, especially in local government. It is the most important part of government that touches our lives. There's nothing that we do on a day-to-day basis that government doesn't touch. The most of that comes out of municipal government. And so my recommendation is to get involved, be vocal, and then require change. And when you see that it's not happening, show up and make sure that your concerns are heard.
Thank you. I would echo what was previously mentioned, which is the importance of showing up as your authentic self. Particularly in the work that you do, whatever that work is, right, within government, you have to show up as yourself, both for the sustainability, but also, again, for the transformative work to actually happen.
I love it. Get involved, require change, and show up as yourself. I love it. Okay, thank you all so much. Matt, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close this out.
Wow, wow, wow. this was an amazing discussion by two amazing individuals who are not only impacting their spaces, whether it's inside the government or as a consultant, but you all are really giving us knowledge. I've been snapping the entire hour, and so the amount of knowledge, Dr. Wilson, that you provided us with the city and the importance of organizations within the company, within the city of Dallas, working together to make this plan a reality. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being in our city so that we can create policies for sustainable improvement so that all are welcome. Kim, I see you. This is our 5th time in this series. This is your first time as a panelist. You never cease to amaze me. Thank you for all of the work that you do, not only for DE&I and A, but also for the culture and how we can build the fabric together. To our moderator, Jared, thank you. Masterfully done facilitating. You are definitely in the Hall of Fame and being allowing us to have these voices of expertise heard so that we can replicate this not only during this live Zoom session, but also in perpetuity as we post this in the future. So thank you for your direction on this panel. Audience members, thank you all very much for your live participation. We look forward to seeing you all next week as we are going to discuss a holistic DE&I approach in business. Please be on the lookout for that sign-in sheet, that registration form, and please look out for the video, which we will publish again, not only on the Urban Search Institute, but it'll be available on YouTube so that you can share with your networks. Thank you all very much, and let's continue to build Dallas and have a great week.